Welcome today to a podcast on human rights and technology leading organisational change. I am really delighted to be joined today by Denise North, whose early experience as a technology and defence industries analyst with the Australian Government led her to what would now be termed a portfolio career across diverse businesses. Denise has held board appointments, led companies as chief executive, and been a strategic consultant and analyst. Driven by her passion for social justice, Denise has also undertaken roles in the not-for-profit sectors and has worked alongside individuals from a range of life experiences, cultures and worldviews. So today, Denise, I'm looking for recommendations according to different role types, and considering your experience, you may be the perfect person to give this. Can I start though with your extensive experience as a board member and educator of prospective directors through various institutions, including the AICD? What do you think this report does mean for directors?
Hi, Fanwin, thank you for that lovely introduction. I think it's a really interesting report and extremely timely, because we find ourselves frequently in a situation where regulation is chasing after technology, and I know one might argue this might be, the technology is already there, and AI and these things are already being developed, but it's still early in some of this new technology phase. So I think it's really important to for there to be good regulation from a director's point of view in terms of use of technology. It just seems to me to fit inside that overarching concern that directors need to have to think about the obligations of the organisation that they're running. And it's really interesting. I talk a lot when, so you mentioned the work that I do with the Institute of Company Directors, and when we're doing those programs, we have aspiring and actual and developing directors in the programs, and chief executives and other executives, and talking about the obligations that organisations have, especially the obligations that business organisations have, because we always have accepted, of course, that governments have obligations to society. But it's now becoming, I think it's a commonplace today to say that all businesses are judged to have obligations to society as well. And of course, non-profit organisations in the third sector and considerable obligations themselves, if only because of the sort of support that they get from across the economy in the form of tax breaks and tax support.
I certainly don't have experience as a director, but I'm aware of the challenges of staying across multiple regulatory frameworks. Yes. And being expected to be an expert across areas that you're not necessarily able to bring to the table. So how do directors stay up to date with how technologies are developing and how they're being used alongside everything else they're expected to be responsible for?
I think it's a really interesting conversation at the moment. We're having a few areas where it's become clear, and I guess IT was one, not necessarily so much in the sorts of technology that you're talking about here, but just where we realised even things like privacy legislation and data storage, cybersecurity is an area we're very much in the minds of directors at the moment, because they worry about the threats to their organisation and they worry about the risk of them not complying with their obligations under all sorts of headings. And so I think the thing that's important we're seeing is you're not going to necessarily, and nor would you want to, turn every director into a cybersecurity expert or an AI expert. That's kind of not the point. The same way that not every director's a finance expert or a marketing expert or a HR expert. Again, the directors need to be able to consider and make decisions across a very broad range of subject matter areas. And so the ways that they are able to do that can be a number of ways. One of the things is you may bring those people with that expertise into your organisation in executive roles. You may boards may choose to bring directors onto the board with specific expertise in those areas, the way that in the past boards would always have made sure that they had the accounting and audit specialist and the legal specialist on their board. Some boards may look to bring in the cybersecurity expert or something like that, but there are other ways, which is basically setting up committees of advisors, boards getting that expertise from consultants or advisors, and in some cases, forming advisory boards for the company or advisory boards for the board to be able to get expertise from a number of people who will help them lift their understanding.
Yeah, that's a fantastic way to go about it, I think. And as you say, not everyone can be an expert in everything, and it's actually not a good use of their time to be so. No. So having those experts. And I think in this situation, it's interesting to think about who the different kinds of experts that you might bring in this regard. So the report itself covers tools like human rights impact assessment or thinking about the explainability of AI. The last section of the report is devoted to accessibility for people with disabilities or just generally making sure that the majority of the population can access your products and services. Are there particular experts you'd be looking at as a board member to bring in to cover some of those issues, or is there one or two that you think you'd start with if you were going along this journey?
Well, I think it's a very good point that you make, because I was mentioning things like cybersecurity experts or artificial intelligence experts, but we're also seeing boards struggle with things like how they build and influence corporate cultures. So cultural experts, experts in customer experience are critically important. And in the same way, experts in human rights, experts in ethical decision making, experts in discrimination or anti-discrimination would be, again, fantastic experts to have in an advisory group, also to have on the board. I think we'll start to see, we've heard over through the COVID period, we've heard a number of people very active in corporate boards talking about, and some headhunter groups, I suppose, in this space as well, talking about shifts in the skill sets being looked for. And so that understanding of ethical decision making and that understanding of building corporate culture and how to manage those things. And you can see some direct links from those, from a range, especially in Australia, a series of royal commissions that brought to light all sorts of interesting things, where you're seeing the response to that in terms of the kinds of people that, so both being brought onto boards, being hired as executives in the organisations, but also potentially becoming advisory boards or brought onto specific committees or being advisors on subject matters.
Yeah, and that raises, I guess, two questions in my mind. We've talked about the obligations that exist through regulation, and obviously those have been very important and have increased, especially after some of the Royal Commissions recently. But I think also organisations are recognising the benefits of these kinds of approaches as well. So we've seen, for example, investors starting to align themselves with organisations who have a certain ethical principles. Do you think boards see those working in tandem, or is there one that's more prevalent than the other? And how do they bring them together in their decision making? I guess the carrot and the approaches.
Yeah, and I think the answer would have to be that you would see, I'm sure, inside some boardrooms at the moment, a compliance focus on these questions. What am I going to be made to do? What is the law going to require me to do? But hopefully you're also seeing lots of organisations that are, and lots of boards of organisations that are taking a more holistic view of what is the role and purpose of this organisation, and how do we fulfil that purpose and pursue our goals in a way that is long-term sustainable across a range of dimensions. And socially and politically and ethically sustainable dimensions are very important dimensions that I think most organisations are working out. You can take a compliance view to everything, but it's likely not to be very helpful to you, and it will be likely viewed as a drain on resource and attention. Whereas if you take a holistic view to how do we best pursue the purpose of this organisation in a sustainable way, then that's potentially a source of a competitive advantage, which is a very different space to be in than look at all these things I have to comply with.
Yeah, that's what I think I love about the way that the approach of the project to responsible innovation, knowing that there will be benefits to, employee engagement, shareholder investment, customer purchasing, as well as meeting your compliance obligations. Have you seen boards consider these kinds of issues in light of the best interests of the company director's duty, or do you think it is considered separately?
It's an interesting one, and there's been a few interesting conversations about that because, strictly speaking, if you take a narrow view of the duty of a director, it is to the company. But then you can say that if you were to define the director's obligation to the company very narrowly, you may fall into the trap of it being too short-term a definition and too risky a definition, and a definition that doesn't encompass potential. Whereas if you accept that for an organisation to be sustainable, it needs to meet a range of expectations that are not necessarily embodied directly in the company, but can be in the company's employees, in the customers, in regulators and other stakeholders and society generally, then I think you're putting yourself in a better position to look at that. I'm not really in a position to be able to outline specific instances where I've seen those differences, but the sense that I get, and with the work that we do in the ASCD faculty, we're encountering a lot of people from a lot of different organisations and having these kinds of conversations frequently. So the sense that I get is that there's a move away, and especially I think if you look forward a little bit to the future, there's younger people have different expectations of the places that they work. Younger, not so young people have different expectations of the sorts of companies they will buy shares in, or they want their superannuation fund to buy shares in. And so those influences are fairly profound. Banks have very different views these days about the sorts of businesses they want to lend money to. These things are powerful. So if a company or a board were inclined to ignore these changes, I think that would be a bit of a not optimistic outlook for that business. A courageous choice.
Oh, I do love a Yes Minister reference, if that's what that was. So I think also, I was reading recently that also more organisations are choosing to report against the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and that actually there was a link found between that level of reporting, or at least successful reporting, with the amount of investment that was happening on the ASX. Have you, in your role as a board, seen committees reporting on or against the Sustainable Development Goals? Or is it more against the legislation of the jurisdiction?
So in the specific boards that I'm on at the moment, I don't have that visibility around the corporate sector, but I think that it is becoming well known that reporting against the SDGs is significant, and I think there are a few different ways that people tend to look. There's, if you go back a little way, people were talking about triple bottom lines and the SDGs, and I'm momentarily forgetting some of the other acronyms, but there are other sets of things, and where different businesses are choosing to make that reporting, to make that public stand. And of course, also you're talking in this conversation, we're talking with that level of reporting, often we're talking mostly about listed corporations, because the visibility of that investors have and shareholders have and lenders to those corporations is of course very high. I think an interesting next phase is likely to be medium-sized and growing businesses in that context as well, to see how that flows through.
Yeah, and thinking of, I guess, the size of the business, the Australia and then New South Wales introduced modern slavery legislation a few years ago now, and it was based on the turnover of the business. Are you seeing that become more important to organisations to report against, or even if, as a best practice, even if they're not actually caught by the legislation itself?
Not specifically, but I imagine that's happening. And one of the things that happens, we know, for instance, if you look at the financial reporting and accountability standards that apply to corporations, it's very much and through for non-profits in the Charities and Non-Profits Commission, the ACNC, you'll see that there are tiers of where people need to apply, and many organisations will actually pitch their reporting and their auditing practices at the tier above where they are today. Now, that's for a couple of reasons. One, because it's better transparency, and sometimes if it's a member association, you might be small enough that you're not required to provide that information, but for member accountability, you might choose to do it. But secondly, most businesses, especially if you go to the commercial space, most businesses have aspirations for growth. Yes. And people are determined to get to the next tier over a period of time. And so I think there's a broad understanding that setting businesses up early on with good governance frameworks and structures is a good way to assist in the growth. And one of the things that has been really interesting, and I think this is a change just in the circles that I move in, I'd say perhaps over the last 5 years, whatever, is in some of the programs where I'm in, where we have people from very small businesses and people who are involved in startups who are talking about getting their governance structures right from the beginning, whereas I do recall conversations that I would have casually sometimes with people, 5-10 years ago, which was, and in the startup space, and what about your boards? And basically there was a bit of a response was, we're way too small to have any time to think about that. That's not for us at this moment. And I think, again, there's been a little shift of an understanding that, in fact, good governance can be a great thing, even for quite a small business.
Yeah, I think there was that famous quote about move fast and break things. I sincerely hope organisations are not employing that as their strategy at the moment. And yeah, I completely agree with you. Having good governance in place is actually going to make a busy professional's life easier rather than more complicated. I've got 2 questions which are a little bit without notice, so feel free to tell me to move on. One of them is, do you know of any examples where you've seen organisations get a commercial benefit from applying either ESG frameworks or something related to the SDGs or human rights in this way?
I can't name them, but okay. I know that there is that there are articles and there is research on those things, but I'm not.
That's okay. That's okay. It was just yeah. And okay, so I'll move back.
I should have looked some up. Yep.
It's actually quite difficult. I found organisations that talk about applying, corporate social responsibility, which is, I suppose, a fairly older term. That seems to be well established. But this more recent, I suppose, movement or aims are not as well covered. So I'll move back to my. Sorry.
Yeah. No, I was just going to say I just had an email today about a sustainability or SDGs and INSEAD webinar coming out. I'll flick you the link actually. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. So I'll move back to my questions that did have notice. So, when you're thinking about, giving advice to your fellow board members or even talking to the organisation for which you are a director, what's, I guess, practical ways that you think organisations could implement some of the recommendations in the report? I mean, you've already given us a really helpful tip in terms of getting advisory committees or experts in, but is there anything else that you think would make, what may seem a confronting or new area, something easy for organisations to implement?
Look, I think it's the same with any area of challenge for a board, is that the most important thing that the board can do is get that difficult topic on the table and have the conversation that says, where is this relevant to us? What are the things? And it's a bit like these days, when you say, if a board sits there and says, how is AI relevant to us? You'd be a brave organisation that said it won't be. It's pretty hard to imagine as you go forward, even if all you're doing, for instance, I mean, if you're using Google Ads to promote your business on social media or whatever it is, you're using algorithms and AI already in what you do, and it can only increase. And for the organisation for the board, I think, to demonstrate to the executive an openness to learning about these questions and an openness to saying we need to ensure that whatever we do in this space is done well and done appropriately and done ethically and in accordance with our culture and our values. And so I think that, you know, there've been a few rounds of going through different bits of technology where people have been caught going, oh, hold on, I had no idea that would affect me. I don't think anyone would really sensibly get to say that anymore and be credible. So getting it on the table, having a conversation, deciding what it is that you need to do, getting the expertise you need. And again, no one needs to become an AI specialist, but we need to have the conversations about to what extent are we using AI in a broad sense? What are we using it for? What could happen if that wasn't being done well? And that's the classic risk conversation. What could happen if this wasn't done well? And on the other side of that, of course, what opportunity is there to use this for good stuff to happen?
Yeah. And that's what I, again, really like about the report is that technology itself is neither good nor bad, but how do we protect against the harms, but how do we take advantage of the efficiencies or increased accessibility? So one final question, possibly, is I think, you know, something that came out of the report for me is there are a lot of examples where companies had developed or started using technology that unintentionally had a discriminatory effect on users. And my working theory, of course, is that if organisations had a robust inclusivity and I've said that wrong, inclusion and diversity program, that they would be able to avoid these kinds of problems because they would have the lived experience in the room. Have you seen boards focus on this element, not necessarily connected to what we're talking about today, but just a general movement towards understanding the importance of inclusion in the workplace?
I certainly have seen that, both and at executive levels and also at board levels. And for instance, I mean, just as a classic example that everyone would be familiar with, if you look at the disability services sector and some of the changes that happened with the NDIS, you know, in the last period, you would have traditionally the boards of many non-profit service providers in the disability space were people whose family members might have suffered from the disability in question, and so the parent or the aunt or the sibling or whomever or the child of the parent of the person with the disability would volunteer to help run the organisation. You're now seeing disabled people with various areas of disability lived experience in that space sitting on boards themselves. That's definitely a change. The thing that I think that the thing you've got to be careful about, I think, with the incorporate lived experience as a way of managing an issue.
Yeah.
The breadth of the things that we're going to have to deal with is such that unless you want a 30-person board, you're not going to have lived experiences of all the things that you need to deal with on your board. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't have of course, we should have. It's interesting. We were talking about diversity in a couple of recent courses, and I think it's interesting. We've moved away from, we started the diversity and inclusion question, certainly the diversity conversation started with, I think, a justice and equity basis. Yeah. It's not right, for instance, for the very glib example, it's not right that there aren't, 50-something% of women on boards and things like that. We moved on to the business case argument for diversity and inclusion, and the business case argument is strong and profound. But I think we shouldn't ditch the social justice and fairness argument for there's a representative value to diversity as well, and I think that's a pretty important one, as well as the business case argument for it. So I would think that in the discrimination thing, one of the things that for people to think about, especially in the artificial intelligence space, one of the things, people say there's an assumption, and I'm you know all this, of course, but the assumption that technology is neutral, Of course, it's not, and anyone who's involved in developing artificial intelligence is bringing their own prejudices and biases to what it is that they develop. So you've got, starting out with a biased algorithm, and so it's just a question of people. Well, not just people. We need to be conscious of that being the fact, and we need to have ways, I think, and that's one of the really interesting things about where this whole approach to technology will go. We need to have ways of identifying what are the biases inside this algorithm and what are they doing, and how might we make them more neutral, or how might we actually bias them the other way if we thought that was appropriate. Whatever it is, that's not necessarily and I don't know, and I defer to people who have much more expertise in this subject matter than I. That's not necessarily, it strikes me, a lived experience question. It's a philosophical question about understanding what the technology is doing and but of course, people with lived experience of discrimination are the ones best able to point out the biases that we might miss.
Yeah, and I think that's true. It's not just the algorithms; it's the data sets in the first place.
Yeah, and what have you collected? Multiplying what you. Yeah.
That it's all objective because the machine has said it, but unfortunately the machine is using information that the biased
somebody programmed it,
have done it. Or it's reflecting actually, I'm sure there's many examples in the legal system where people have had discriminatory decisions made against them, and that's now a decision within the data set. So it's also identifying where that's happened as well, rather than trying to remove it from the data set. But as you say, possibly a question for data scientists rather than about boards. And I think, I completely agree with your point about how big a board should be and how effective it can be. And hopefully it's also something that the organisation that the board is responsible for is also looking at in terms of their, not just recruitment practices, but retention processes as well, to make sure that they're getting people to be involved in the strategy of the organisation, not just as a token in the I&D program. Okay, that is the end of all of my questions, and I think we've covered that all really well. Is there anything you wanted to add, or final words on this subject?
No, just thank you for. I'm really glad that I read the report and started thinking about these things. So I'm very grateful for the conversation. Thank you.